The submitted script offers a highly immersive, 24-hour sensory tour of New Amsterdam on the eve of its bloodless surrender to the English. The narrative timeline presents a glaring chronological contradiction between the advertised premise and the actual historical setting.
Right, because the title of the piece promises an exploration of what New York looked like in 1650.
Exactly. But then, the very first scene drops the reader squarely into late August of 1664.
Complete with a literal countdown to the arrival of 4 English warships just 3 weeks away.
It is incredibly jarring to be handed a map for the middle of a journey and then, immediately shoved across the finish line.
Yeah, the weakness here is that the framing promises a mid-century snapshot, but it delivers a high-stakes climax. So the reader spends the first several pages trying to calibrate their mental timeline instead of just sinking into the world.
Which is a massive shame because the sensory details, like the smell of the crushed oyster shell paths on Pearl Street, they are incredibly strong.
Oh, absolutely. And the 18 languages spoken, the pigs wandering the dirt paths, it is all very vivid.
But because the reader is mentally stuck trying to reconcile the year 1650 with the impending doom of 1664, that temporal mismatch just shatters the illusion.
Right.
It feels a bit like buying a ticket for a documentary about the Roaring Twenties, but the opening scene is the 1929 stock market crash.
That is a perfect analogy.
So how can the author resolve this without losing the excellent tension of the impending English arrival?
Well, my suggestion for improvement is to align the title, the hook, and the narrative framework to capitalize fully on the dramatic irony of August 1664.
Okay, so just lean into it completely.
Exactly. Or alternatively, utilize 1650 as a baseline to show how rapidly the colony changed by 1664.
Can you give some concrete examples of what that would actually look like?
Sure. So option A would be to retitle the piece to something like The Last 24 Hours of New Amsterdam, 1664.
Oh, I like that. That instantly aligns the reader's expectations with the text's climax.
Right, it puts the ticking clock right on the cover. Suddenly, every mundane detail is layered with tension. Option B is to keep the 1650 title, but add a brief framing device at the very beginning.
Something that says like, to understand the New York of 1650, we have to look at its final days as New Amsterdam in 1664.
Yeah, exactly that. Now, just as a reminder, these are only a few potential ways to solve the framing issue.
Right. The key is ensuring the audience's chronological anchor actually matches the narrative setting, and establishing that this is 1664 brings us directly to the climax of the surrender, which reveals a deeper thematic opportunity regarding the colony's management. The material introduces the Dutch West India Company's profit-driven motives, but misses an opportunity to fully connect this corporate apathy to the colony's ultimate bloodless downfall.
Yeah, the script accurately notes that the Dutch West India Company, or the WIC, prioritized Brazilian sugar over northern beaver pelts.
And it mentions how they overruled Governor Stuyvesant on admitting Sephardic Jewish refugees for the sake of profit.
Right, so the corporate influence is definitely there. But the weakness is that the script treats the final surrender, where the citizens just flat out refuse to fight, simply as a lack of patriotism.
Right, as if they were just cowards or lacking national pride.
Exactly. Rather than treating it as the inevitable result of a population that viewed themselves as neglected corporate employees rather than loyal state subjects. Why would anyone see their homes bombarded to defend a corporate balance sheet?
But let me gently push back on that for a second. Is there a risk that focusing too heavily on the corporate structure makes the narrative too dry? Like, does it take away from the vivid, chaotic tavern culture and Stuyvesant's tyrannical wooden-legged persona?
Okay, so that is a valid concern, sure. You do not want a dry economic essay. But my suggestion for improvement is to use Stuyvesant's hypocrisy and the town's chaotic nature as the specific vehicles to highlight the company-town dynamic.
Okay, so strengthen the thematic through line of corporate colony versus empire?
Yes, so the chaos does not feel like a distraction from the corporate apathy, but the direct result of it. The surrender needs to feel like a calculated business decision.
Do you have some concrete examples for how to weave that in seamlessly?
Yeah, so when describing the 18 languages and the high tavern count, 1 in 4 buildings being a tavern,
right,
explicitly frame this not just as diversity or quirky local color, but as the reality of a transient corporate outpost where no one feels a deep nationalistic root to the soil.
That makes a lot of sense. They are there to extract wealth, not build a utopia. And what about Stuyvesant himself?
During the marketplace scene, contrast his martial posturing with his silver-banded wooden leg from a Caribbean battle with the merchants arguing over storage fees in the hair-graft canal.
Ah, planting the seed early that these people care about commerce, not the WIC's geopolitical pride.
Exactly. Frame the final line, why die for the Dutch West India Company, not as a sudden realization, but as the thesis the entire day has been building toward.
That corporate pragmatism didn't just dictate the surrender, it dictated human lives, bringing us to how the script handles its most vulnerable populations. The portrayal of marginalized groups relies on isolated vignettes that could be more deeply integrated into the colony's foundational economic engine.
Yeah, the current inclusion is there. The script mentions the Lenape trading at the edge of town.
And the enslaved Africans living in rough shacks near the fort.
Right, and it even notes the complex half-free status some of them held.
So the empathy in the writing is definitely clear.
It is. But the weakness is that treating these groups as side tours on the 24-hour walk makes them feel peripheral, like side quests.
When, factually, their labor and technology were the central gears keeping the WIC's entire operation running.
Exactly. They were the foundation, not just background flavor.
I noticed the script mentions wampum as a currency the Dutch learned from the English, but it feels like a passing trivia fact. How can the writer elevate details like this to show active integration rather than passive observation?
Well, the suggestion for improvement is to shift the narrative lens from observing marginalized groups in isolation to demonstrating how their specific contributions, both cultural and material, were being systematically extracted.
Extracted to fuel the global European market, you mean?
Exactly. You have to track the money. Like, as a concrete example, instead of just mentioning that wampum is currency, explicitly connect it to the beaver pelt trade.
Show how the Dutch basically weaponized the coastal shell bead production.
Right. They weaponized it to monopolize the inland Mohawk trapping routes. The Dutch could not manufacture wampum themselves, so they completely relied on the indigenous populations, which makes the indigenous economy the literal engine of European felt hat fashion. Exactly. Without the wampum, there are no beaver pelts, and without the pelts, the Dutch West India Company abandons New Amsterdam entirely.
That makes it so much more structural to the story. By connecting those dots, the Lenape are no longer just a quaint vignette at the edge of town.
They are the absolute foundation of the town's existence.
We can apply that exact same logic to the enslaved and half-free African population too.
Yes. When discussing the African gardens growing okra and watermelon, tie this directly to the physical survival of the colony.
So explain that the half-free legal category wasn't just a Dutch pragmatism operating in a vacuum.
Exactly. It was a calculated, cold-blooded WIC strategy to create a buffer class of laborers during Keith's war.
They were using them as human shields, essentially.
Physical spaces, like the windmill or the wall itself.
Showing that the physical infrastructure of Wall Street was built on this exact intersection of enslaved labor and indigenous defense.
Precisely. It integrates them directly into the core engine of the story. If the author integrates these groups into the core economic engine, the earlier point about corporate apathy becomes infinitely sharper.
Let's briefly summarize the three main actionable takeaways. First, aligning the chronological framing with the 1664 climax to fix the timeline disorientation.
Second, deepening the thematic focus on the Dutch West India Company's corporate pragmatism to explain the final surrender.
And third, integrating the economic and technological contributions of the Lenape and enslaved Africans directly into the colony's core engine.
We warmly invite the listener to apply these structural and thematic layers to their text and to submit their revised historical script back for another critique.